One step, one miscalculation, and we will find ourselves in a nuclear war. Russia's annexation of eastern Ukraine will escalate the conflict more than you think. People in the West are calm, or uninterested in the situation. But I tell you, I'm pretty sure that most misunderstand the situation and underestimate the threat that we have to deal with. In this report, I will explain why Russia is out of options at this point, why Europe's path to peace with Russia died with Nord Stream 1, and why the US isn't going to de-escalate the conflict. Welcome to Dark New World. With the annexation of the regions Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia and Kherson, Russia has changed forever. Not because it's the first time for them, it's not. When we think back to 2014 and the annexation of Crimea. Not because the annexation will change the power balance in favor for the Kremlin, no. Russia has changed because it chose a path that doesn't allow it to turn back. Russia chose the path of war. And while there was the option to stop back in February, we now face a completely different situation. The 4 annexed regions make up 15% of Ukraine's territory. None were fully under Russian control at the time. The annexation is the largest in Europe since World War II, surpassing Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea. It created a land connection between the Russian mainland and Crimea and cuts off Ukraine from the Sea of Azov. The annexation occurred after internationally unrecognized referendums held days prior, which were organized by Russian occupation authorities in territories where hostilities were ongoing and much of the population had fled. It occurred 7 months after the start of the invasion and less than a month after the start of the Ukrainian Kharkiv counteroffensive. But why would Russia annex the eastern part of the country while Ukrainians still control parts of the region? Why would Putin do this at this time and in this situation? There are some possible scenarios that could in part explain it. In the first scenario, the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which liberated thousands upon thousands of square kilometers from Russian occupation in a short amount of time, is continuing and threatening Russia's land gains from the past 6 months. The Russian army paid a high price in casualties for the small gains of land it was able to conquer. The Russian military forces have massive problems with logistics and manpower. They find themselves outnumbered, often at a ratio of 10 to 1. Now pair that with the dysfunctional logistics of the army and the situation becomes unstable. In fear of bigger losses, the annexation of the territory in eastern Ukraine allows Russia several things. For example, Vladimir Putin ordered the mobilization of circa 300,000 troops for the war in Ukraine. People were given the promise that they will only serve inside Russia and not on a territory of Ukraine. With the Donbass being now part of Russia in the eyes of the Kremlin, the troops can be easily sent there to the front lines. The second important part for Russia is the fact that the Kremlin can present the annexation as a partial win and a step towards the end goal. Remember, the annexation came days after the Ukrainian counteroffensive and some decisive defeats for the Russian army, as well as gigantic backlash from the mobilization efforts in Russia. While the war was far away for the first 6 months, now every Russian could be sent there to the front lines in a certain age range. Not only saw every major Russian city some protests, but almost 500,000 men had fled the country just weeks after the announcement. To bring the Donbass region into the Russian state makes it easier for the Kremlin to create motivation to fight in Ukraine. It's easier to defend your home country than invade your neighbor. It's a psychological trick to improve the situation with the mobilization. Also, fighting in the Donbass has now a heightened urgency, because from now on, it's Mother Russia that's under attack. And here we come to the elephant in the room. The most important and most dangerous consequence from the annexation and the Ukrainian counteroffensive. The Ukrainian leadership under President Volodymyr Zelensky refused the Russian offer to negotiate. The plan of Kiev is to retake all of the occupied territory and restore the pre-2014 borders of Ukraine. Now, in the eyes of the Kremlin, the Ukrainian forces will attack Russian territory. And Russian doctrine clearly states that if the Russian state is under attack and faces an existential threat, like for example, the territorial integrity of the country, the use of thermonuclear weapons is allowed. So we are continuing to move closer to a worst-case scenario, like often stated on this channel. Many news outlets worldwide are starting to talk about tactical nuclear weapons. It seems like the world is taking Putin's threats more seriously than before. An interesting thought is that many outlets describe tactical nuclear bombs as mini-nukes. And I want to hold on here for a second and say this couldn't be further from the truth. These warheads have an immense firepower. You can compare them to Fat Man, the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima back in the Second World War. It is still a city killer. It is still radioactive. It still can kill hundreds of thousands of people in seconds. And it certainly will have the potential to escalate the conflict into a full-blown nuclear war. It would change the way we fight wars forever. And to normalize it is a bad idea. In a scenario in which the Russians would detonate the first warhead over Ukraine, it could be minutes or it could be months to a nuclear World War III. But there would be almost nothing that could stop it anymore. And the situation that the world is right now, it would be certainly just a matter of time. And I'm not talking about years here. Like a frog that gets cooked alive slowly, we don't realize how off rails the world is right now. Remember, it's been just 2.5 years since the start of the pandemic. It is crazy that we are now talking down the effects of tactical nuclear weapons in the media. The conditioning to accept the possibility of nuclear war, to downplay the risk, downplay the consequences and aftermath of a nuclear exchange is dangerous and absurd. They talk about it so casually as life will just carry on as usual. The world is slowly losing its mind, and we can feel it. But that's just the start. Now, if Russia would use one of these warheads, where and how would they use it? This is an interesting question, because it would be a new form of warfare. The Americans targeted civilian population centers to produce as many casualties as possible to bring the Japanese emperor into a position in which he can only surrender. Today, a tactical nuke would have similar effects. But Russia would probably use it in a field outside of any population centers. This would be a warning and a way to force Kiev to the negotiation table. If Zelensky would still refuse, Russia could use another of the approximately 1,000 tactical nuclear warheads of its arsenal. The next bomb would probably hit a city or town, and then you can escalate this to a strike at the capital, Kiev. Unless you have a concentration of Ukrainian forces at one point, a nuclear strike on military targets wouldn't make sense. The front line in Ukraine is vast, and forces are spread thin. But the use of a nuclear device could have the shock and awe effect and demoralize Ukrainian troops. So these weapons could be used to force negotiations or demoralize Ukrainian resistance. Another option for the Kremlin would be a nuclear test as a warning. In that case, Russia would use the least escalating option it has left other than doing nothing. This could, to some extent, bring Ukrainian officials to the negotiation table. The million-dollar question would be how a US retaliation could look like. The use of a nuclear device would certainly trigger a response from NATO. One option could be a conventional strike on Russian forces in Ukraine and in Russia, close to the original border. This could be paired with strikes on Russian bases overseas, like in Syria. Another option could be a conventional strike on the Russian army infrastructure inside Russia. But this could lead to further escalation and triggering a mad scenario. On the other hand, Russia would probably lose India and China as trade partners. So the question is, would Russia really use the weapons and risk to get isolated on the world stage? Or would the vast resources secure future trade with Asian partners and allies? As all of this is progressing, I think I don't want to find it out. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a walk in the park compared to the situation we have today. Not because the danger is clear, but the opposite. The situation is complex and the stakes are high. The perfect recipe for disaster. We can only hope that the button doesn't get pushed and another solution will be found to end the conflict. Because things like the refugee crisis, the hunger crisis, the economic crisis, the climate crisis, the death of the biosphere, and the danger of water wars and many other problems are still here. But I guess there's not much to talk about climate change when we hear about nuclear war on TV. If you want to hear more about the wars of the coming decade, check out this video here. And on the right, we have a video about how to cope with collapse. And that's something we all have to deal with these days. My name is Dennis, thank you for watching and goodbye.